Hello, my name is Michael Plyler and I'm a photographer who's been photographing the Highland Maya of Guatemala since 1982. And this is my slideshow corresponding to an exhibit I have at the Carson City Courthouse Gallery sponsored by Capital City Arts Initiative. That show is entitled Selected Works, the Maya of Guatemala and Western Landscapes. So this is a map of Mayan Mesoamerica, and as you can see down at the bottom is the country of Guatemala. My first trip to Guatemala was in 1980, and that trip was a 1-week stay in Guatemala after 4 weeks in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. When I got off the bus in Antigua, Guatemala for the first time, I was walking down the street and thought I had spied a friend of mine who I'd gone to college with at the University of Montana in Missoula. I had not seen Joe in 4 years, and I saw him walking down the sidewalk. So I called his name, and sure enough, it was him. So we met for dinner that night, and come to find out, Joe had just arrived, been in the country about 2 weeks, and was beginning a 2-year stint in the Peace Corps. In that first visit in 1980, I visited Chichen Itza, which if you look at the top of the map, there are 4 structures at the very top of the Yucatan Peninsula. The second one from the right is the Castillo at Chichen Itza. I visited Uxmal, which is the structures on the left in the map at the top. And then Dizibilchaltun is just above that. And I also visited Palenque down in Chiapas. You can see the structure between the letters M and E in the title Mexico. And the slides I'm going to show you of Mayan ruins for this talk are all from Tikal. If you look at the map of Guatemala, at the top in the middle are 2 pyramids facing each other. That's the map's designation of Tikal. I want to tell you a few things about Guatemala before we move on. Guatemala is a country about the size of Ohio. Currently it has 17.2 million citizens or residents. In 1994, the population was only about 8.3 million. Of today's 17.2 million people, approximately 42% of them are pure Mayan. And the population growth that Guatemala has seen ever since about the 19th century makes it the fastest growing country in the Western Hemisphere in terms of population. So this is a quote from art historian Galati Griffin. He's at Princeton University. Here in the jungles of Central America, you had princes of royal blood being proud enough to sign their paintings on their pots in different styles, while in Europe, my ancestors were painting their bodies blue and bashing each other's heads with shillelaghs, and no king or noble could read or write. The environment in the Yucatan and the Petén, which is the northern part of Guatemala, it's limestone from Cretaceous and Tertiary mollusks. The forests here observe pollutants that contribute to global warming. There is not a single river to drain this entire region, and 10 to 15% of natural medicines prescribed today come from plants grown here. So the Yucatan and the Petén is lowland Maya. I've been photographing the Highland Maya. The 2 groups were contemporaneous during the classic Maya period, dates of which I will show you shortly. And so when people talk about the Maya, especially in terms of their past civilization, they're generally speaking about lowland Maya cultural benchmarks. So here's just a few to give you an idea of how advanced this culture actually was. They calculated the path of Venus with an error of only 14 seconds of year. Their lunar cycle was accurate to within 24 seconds of today's atomic clocks. Their calendar, projected 30,000 years into the future, has an error of less than 3 minutes. They had the most advanced writing system in the Western Hemisphere. They pioneered the concept of zero approximately 2,000 years ago. Zero was not used in Europe until 1200 AD. They invented the corbelled arch, and it figures prominently in their architecture. There's a site at Cuello Belice dated to 2500 BC. Therefore, we have a continuous culture for some 4,500 years. San Bartolo, just north of Tikal, the oldest known royal tomb, dates to 1500 years BC. And poetry found on the Pacific coast near Tapachula, Mexico, dates to 1700 BC. This is almost 1,000 years before Rome. Their empire lasted roughly 6 times as long as the Roman Empire, and despite all of these accomplishments, they had neither the wheel or metal tools. So here's some archaeological history. First, I want to give you the significant dates in Mayan history. The pre-classic period is 2000 BC to 250 AD, even though I have previously stated that we have evidence going back to 2500 BC. The classic period, which all of the structures in the slides of Tikal that I'm about to show you were built during the classic period, and this was the flourishing of the lowland Maya civilizations. Classic is 250 AD to 900 AD, and the post-classic is 900 AD to 1502. And 1502 is the Spanish contact. And at this time, Chichen Itza, which I had mentioned earlier with regards to the map of Mayan Mesoamerica, Chichen Itza was still a thriving city at the time that the Spanish arrived. Tikal, Copan, Piedras Negras, Quirigua, Yaxchilan, any number of Mayan sites other than Chichen Itza had already reached their zenith and had slipped into decline. So the first two guys that acquainted the greater world at large with Mayan culture, an Englishman named Alfred Maudslay, who studied Copan and Quirigua, Copan being in Honduras and Quirigua in Guatemala. He studied there in the 1880s, went to the site, and then he and a German named Teoberto Mahler studied Chichen Itza extensively in that same decade. In the study of Mayan culture that led to archaeologists being able to tell us incredibly precise information about the ancient culture, the first breakthrough was made by a Harvard art historian named Tatiana Proskuryov. She is Russian, obviously. She correctly deduced that dates carved on stela at Piedras Negras, this is a site in Guatemala, commemorated important dates in the lives of individual kings and queens. Thus, the Mayan hieroglyphic code was first cracked. While researching the chronology of changing styles of Maya sculpture, she discovered that the dates shown on the monumental stela were actually historical, the birth, accession, and death dates for Mayan rulers. Analyzing the pattern of dates and hieroglyphs, she was able to demonstrate a sequence of 7 rulers who ruled over a span of 200 years at Quirigua. Knowing the context of the inscriptions, Mayan epigraphers were then able to decipher the hieroglyphs. Mayans are famous for their calendars. They have a count and a calendar that they call the long count. And the long count in Mayan culture takes us to a fixed date of August 10th, 3114 BC as the beginning of Maya culture. So their basic year was 360 days long with 5 extra days, so the same length as our Gregorian calendar. But they also had a sacred year that was 260 days long, made up of 13 20-day periods called katuns. Using the August long count date as a starting point in Mayan history, modern archaeologists can say with certainty exact dates in Mayan history. So for example, a gentleman named Chanbalum became king of Palenque on January 10th, 684 AD, and a ruler archaeologists call Curlsnout ascended to Tikal's throne on September 13th, 379 AD. Cultural dispersion. So Mesoamerica extends from north-central Mexico to the western reaches of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Maya territory covers roughly the eastern half of Mesoamerica, and approximately it's 1/2 the size of Texas, including all of Guatemala, Belize, western Honduras, Salvador, and most of the Mexican states of Quintana Roo, Campeche, Yucatan, and most of Chiapas and part of Tabasco. Populations of the larger classic Mayan cities, for example, Tikal is estimated to have a population of 90,000, and Caracol in Belize, 120,000. And the latest research pushes those numbers perhaps even higher. So my first visit to Tikal was in 1982. My friend Joe, that I had met in Antigua on that first visit in 1980, invited me to come back once he became established in the country and stay with him, and he would help us travel around. I came with 2 friends. Joe worked in the Peace Corps. He worked in the Petén, where Tikal is. One of his major accomplishments during his time in the Peace Corps was establishing a wildlife preserve to conserve the national bird of Guatemala. This bird is called the quetzal. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of the quetzal, but the currency of the country is also named quetzales after the bird. When Joe was working in the Petén, he met an expat American from Florida. David Kuhn was his name, and David opened an RV campground in the Petén on the shores of the Lake Petenitza, which is a large lake in the Petén in Guatemala. And we took a chicken bus from Flores, the capital of Petén, after flying there from Guatemala City. Joe met us at the airport. We get on the bus. We go to a little place called El Ramate, which is essentially just some thatched huts on the side of the road at El Ramate. And El Ramate is approximately 1/2 the distance between Flores, the capital of the Petén, and Tikal. David Kuhn was waiting. The lake came right up to the road, like within, I'd say 30, 40 yards. He had 2 canoes there. Joe jumped in one and drove it. David drove the other one. Myself and my friends climbed in, and we stayed at his RV campground. Now the lake, as I said previously, the Petén has no rivers draining it. So Lake Petenitza drains through the bottom, through the limestone strata, the porous limestone substrate. Well, there was a lot of lumbering occurring in the Petén at this time, ceiba and mahogany. And as a result of all this clear cutting, debris from heavy monsoon rains would wash off the slopes into the lake and clog the bottom of the lake. With the limestone clogged and the pores blocked, the lake rose because the water was not draining. The road leading to David's RV campground was about 2 kilometers long, and it became flooded when the lake rose. So he was hurting for business. He was happy to have us there, and every morning we would get up and he would take us in the canoes back to El Ramadi, and we would get on the chicken bus and go to Tikal. We got to the road about 7 in the morning, and then the bus would drop us back at about between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. So the first day of Tikal, we're there. Tikal is a national park preserving the archaeological history and some very fascinating wildlife, including howler and spider monkeys, a lot of indigenous birds like parrots and toucans. And there are these major thoroughfares, for want of a better word, are about as wide as a 1.5 lane road. They're called causeways. And you walk through the causeway and you're completely encased in the jungle canopy. And then you come to a big opening and you see, this is my first vision of Tikal after walking 20 minutes through the jungle. And this is another view of Temple 2 taken from Temple 1 across the way. We're standing in that little, you can see the doorway in that white band just below the roof comb on Temple 2. So we're in that same place in Temple 1 looking across the Great Plaza. You can see this chain in the foreground. That's so people can hold on to it while they climb the steps to get up the temple. Behind Temple 2 are Temples 3 and 4. And you can see the thick jungle between the various temples. This is Temple 5. Temple 5 is the tallest Mayan structure in the New World, 225 feet. As you can see, the roof comb is completely overtaken by vegetation. You can see that wall, that the corresponding doorway into that room below the roof comb at Temple 5. When Mahler and Maudsley first encountered Mayan ruins, they would walk through the jungle and see what appeared to be hills covered with vegetation, which were in fact structures that had been overgrown by the jungle in the intervening, that would be about 800-900 years between the demise, say, of Tikal and the arrival of Maudsley and Mahler. So this is the Great Plaza and the North Acropolis, taken from the flanks of Temple 5 that I just showed you. Temple 1 is here on the right. If you look about in the middle of the stairs, you can see a guy in a white shirt climbing up the stairs. Then all that structure to the left and behind Temple 1 is the North Acropolis. This is Temple 1 and the North Acropolis to the left, taken from Temple 2. And down, sort of bisecting the middle foreground of the photograph, you can see about 4 or 5 steps there leading up to a flat area at the base of the North Acropolis. And in that flat area, you can see some vertically standing large stone pieces. And then below the steps in front of Temple 1, you can see some more vertical standing large stone structures, and also some round stone discs standing in front of those vertical rock pieces. And these are the stela, which I referenced earlier. So to the right of Temple 1, out of the frame of that previous photograph, would be the East Acropolis. And this grassy area here in the left in this photograph is the ball court. And unlike the Super Bowl, there was severe incentive to win your game in the ball court, because the losing team typically was beheaded if they lost the match. And there was no Beyonce performing at halftime during a Mayan ball game. So you walk through the jungle and you'll see stuff. And here's some unrestored stela. As you can see, the one on the right is at a diagonal pitch and half swallowed up by the ground. They're all covered with vegetation. Behind the bigger stela on the left, you can see what looks like a mound structure. And it's not a hill or a mound, but is in fact a piece of architecture, again, that's been overgrown by the jungle in the intervening years after the abandonment of Tikal. So here's a restored stela. Notice all the carving. So the artisans carved these designs in the limestone slabs that were quarried near the city. And as I said earlier, the stela, as the code was broken by Tatania Proskuryakov, the stela commemorate dates in rulers' reigns through the various points in history of the city. This is a detail of that stela. This gentleman here is called Chak. He's a rain god. At Tikal, there's a small archaeological museum. And so I went inside there, and they have some very key pieces. One of the ones is this. This is a incense burner. This is ceramic. It stands about, I would say about 2.5 feet tall. These two objects, this one and the following one that I'm showing you, I had to photograph through a glass case, so the resolution and precision of the imagery is not what I would ultimately hope for, but you get the idea. And this is a lidded vessel from 426 AD, and the significance of this piece is painted on the ceramic portions here are imagery from Teotihuacan culture, way up in Mexico, closer to Mexico City. And when the Spanish arrived at Chichen Itza in the 16th century, there were Teotihuacan folks living in the city alongside Mayans. And so the Teotihuacan people and the Mayan people had this relationship, and they had a trade route between the Yucatan and Teotihuacan home territory. So I talked about Lake Paytanitza, here's the lake. This was one afternoon after we had come back from Tikal, and we were waiting for David to arrive in the canoe to take us back to the campground. And these two guys were out in there. This is like a dugout canoe, and then they put a wooden side rails around it to increase the depth after they've already hollowed out the log. And then this little guy, he was about 12, I believe. So he had just brought in his catch. So these little small fish that most North American anglers living in, say, the United States or Canada would probably throw back, he was going to take this home and give it to Mom so she could make fish soup for dinner. So now we've left the lowland Maya area, the Petén and the Yucatan, and we're in the highlands of Guatemala. And the highlands are in the Sierra Madre, which in that previous slide at the beginning of the map of the Yucatan and Guatemala, the Sierra Madre skirts the Pacific coast. There's a coastal plain that's not real broad, and then boom, the Sierra Madres jut up there. This is the collision of the Pacific plate and the North American plate, creating this mountain range, and then they run all the way into South America, where they become the Andes, and there it's the South American plate and the Pacific plate. But one of the key villages that I like to spend time in the highlands was called Chichicastenango. It is a big market village. Mayan folks come from villages miles around to attend Chichi's market on Thursday and Sunday. Market days in Chichi have been Thursday and Sunday for hundreds of years. This house is fairly typical of many houses in Guatemala in terms of being brightly colored, brightly painted on the outside and having contrasting colors, say, between the walls and the doors. So we've got a green motif with a little purple trim at the bottom and a nice bright red door. The woman about to enter in the house is a Mayan woman. She has her child on her back in a sling called a sute. I just thought I'd throw this in. As you can see, crush. It's a very popular drink in Guatemala, not only in Mayan towns, but all over the country. These crush signs are ubiquitous. The interesting thing about Chichicastenango, or one of the many interesting things, is they kicked the Catholic Church out in the early mid 18th century. So they prohibited the priests from saying Mass for quite a number of years, like over 100 years. And when they kicked them out, there were all these religious objects associated with the altar and everything in the church, like these silver staffs that these gentlemen have protruding above their heads. And let's say the silver candlesticks on the altar, maybe a silver crucifix. And all these objects were kept in a box called the coffer. And the keepers of the coffer are called the cofradia. And they are the elders of the village, and they're sort of a socio-quasi-political entity. There would still, today, for example, there is still a actual governmental body like a town council and a mayor. The mayor would be called the alcalde, but the cofradia is the tribal elders, if you will, or the village elders. And if you and I had a dispute about a pig, we would present our case to the members of the cofradia. They would render a decision, and that was that. So these guys, all with this elaborate headdress and very colorful headdress, these are members of the cofradia. And the cofradia, every Sunday, they reenact this procession where when they finally let the Catholic Church say Mass and let the priests back in, they would have this procession through the streets, and then they would enter the church and the priest would ask permission to say Mass. So this is a reenactment every Sunday. Again, the cofradia gentlemen are the guys with the brightly colored headdresses. The two gentlemen on the right that are in Western attire are they're the front bearers carrying a float through the streets. They lift those rods up onto their shoulders, and you can see a statue cut off on the right edge of the photo there. That's a little statue of Jesus all dressed up. And then you can see the women on the right with the white blouses and these stripes of a woven design on their sleeves. And then over here on the left, these two women, one has a blue huipil blouse, and the woman closest to the in the foreground has a floral design, and there's a woman in front of her who has a geometric design on her blouse or huipil. And the floral design is the older design, and the geometric design is a design that's come into favor more recently in Chichi. So I'm just going to show you some scenes on a given market day. This woman is a flower vendor. She would have picked those beautiful, huge calla lilies off the side of the road walking into the market, and she sits down on the steps of the front portion of the church and sells her wares. These are loofahs, and the loofah is removed from a squash or a gourd, and you can see they're all contained in this fishnet looking structure, and this whole net full of loofahs would be cinched up and attached to a leather strap that would go across a man's forehead. He would hoist this whole thing up, and all the loofahs would sit on his back and he'd be hunched over with the forehead strap connected to the basket of loofahs, and he would make his way through the streets to find his stall to commence to sell his loofahs. This is a butcher shop, a carniceria. You can see in the upper right corner of the doorway there's a red flag jutting out. That red flag lets you know that there's fresh meat today. So if you walk down the sidewalk of a Mayan village and you see a red flag protruding from a doorway in front of you, you know there's fresh meat to be had. You can see one piece of meat hanging on a hook above the guy on the left. There's no walk-in refrigerators. It's just all open air and room temperature, so to speak. And this is yarn, hilado. And the Mayan women are known as some of the world's most accomplished weavers. And so a woman would go to the market and go to the section where they sell yarn and buy her yarn and go home and weave her sute or her huipil or possibly a shawl, a rebozo, on a backstrap loom, which is a loom which attaches to her waist and the other end is tied off on a tree. And she would make larger pieces by weaving individual panels on the backstrap loom and then joining them together. In the market in Chichi, it's sort of laid out like, for want of a better analogy, a Walmart. There's a section for produce, fruits and vegetables. There's another section for livestock, be it chicken, pigs, cows, horses. If you want to buy manufactured goods, you go over here. And the latest addition to most Indian markets are the inclusion of a section where they sell woven goods to tourists for souvenirs. This is the cemetery in Chichi, and here's a little vase that's built into the design of a headstone so that you can go and bring fresh flowers and stick them in the vase and pay your respects to your loved one that's buried there. Oh, about a mile, or rather a kilometer and a half outside of Chichicastenango is a hill called Pascual Abaj. And the Mayan there have been performing ceremonies at this hill. You can see some stone figures on that altar that has the illuminated candles. And you go to the hill and you say a certain ceremony depending on what you hope to accomplish. So if your wife is pregnant and you want a healthy baby and an uncomplicated birth, you'll perform one ceremony and burn a certain color candle. If you want your crops to be plentiful that year, you'll say another incantation and perform a ceremony with a different colored candle. Or if you want wealth overall, maybe you burn another, perhaps green candle to ask the gods to bless you with wealth. And this hill has been there for centuries, and the ceremonies have been being performed there for that amount of time. And I heard about the hill, so I went up there hoping to photograph a ceremony. And so I went one morning and I set up my camera and tripod, and sure enough, in about 10 or 15 minutes, a gentleman showed up. So I asked him if he was going to perform a ceremony, and he replied in the affirmative. So I asked him if he would be willing to let me photograph him performing his ceremony, and I would pay him. And he said yes. So he starts his ceremony, and you can see this gentleman here on the right with the red bandana on his head. He's gesturing with his right hand held out. There's all these gestures and incantations in the Mayan dialect, which in Quiche or Chichicastenango, Quiche is the department. There are about 25 departments in the country of Guatemala. They're analogous to our states. And Quiche is the department, and the language spoken in Chichicastenango and in the department of Quiche, for the most part, is Quiche. And there are about 25 or 28 Mayan dialects spoken in Guatemala. And two Mayans who speak different dialects cannot speak to each other in Maya, and they must communicate in their second language, which is, of course, Spanish. So all these ceremonies occur in Quiche, and this guy was going on and on and on. So I had photographed one roll's worth, which is 15 exposures, put a second roll in the camera, and I was about halfway through the second roll when he stopped in mid-sentence, and he turned to me and he said, "You know, you're taking a lot of pictures." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, I didn't know you were going to take so many pictures, so I'm going to need more money." And I said, "Okay, that's fine, but once we agree on whatever that new sum of money is, then I want to photograph until I'm satisfied and finished, and then that's it." And he goes, "Okay, that's fine." So I agreed to pay him some more money, and I gave him the money, and I said, "You know, I've heard that there's ceremonies where they cut the head off of a chicken. Are you going to do that in your ceremony today?" And he said, "No, but were I to do that, that would cost you a lot of money." So we leave Chichicastenango, and if you're traveling from Guatemala basically west to east, you'll be on the Pan Am Highway, or now it's called the Carretera Interamericana because it connects all the countries in Mesoamerica. And if you're really adventurous, you can take it across the Isthmus of Panama into South America. I have driven from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Guatemala in my own vehicle and back. I've gone to Guatemala on almost any contrivance in terms of transportation with the exception of a boat or a ship. I've flown there, I've ridden buses, I've ridden trains, I took my own vehicle. One trip I made in, I believe it was 86, 87. I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I took a bus to the airport in Albuquerque, flew to El Paso, Texas, took a taxi to the border at Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, got to the train station there, got a berth on the train for 36 hours to Mexico City, and then took a 24-hour bus ride to Guatemala City. On the return, I opted to buy a one-way plane ticket because that was just right at the limit of the adventure of travel that I wanted. So this is we're traveling through the Highlands now, the Sierra Madre. The Pan Am Highway, Chichi would lie to the north, and we're now going to a lake called Lago Atitlan, and the lake lies to the south of the Pan Am Highway. And these are the fields, the agricultural fields we pass along the way. You can see this patchwork of quilted agricultural fields, the field in the foreground with the little trees. The brown stuff is last year's corn crop. You can see on the hill on the left, there's a very steep plot going up the side of that hill, and yet it's being planted, and most likely in corn, maybe beans, but I would guess corn. You can drive down the road in Guatemala frequently and see gentlemen with a rope tied around their waist, and the end of that rope tied around a tree so that they don't fall down the slope while they till the soil. So this is Lake Atitlan. It was formed in this high mountain valley. The surface of the lake is probably, I'm going to say around 5,500 feet elevation. You can see a volcano there behind a smaller hill, which looks like a very old, sort of broken off volcano. I'm not sure. I know that taller structure is definitely a volcano. There are any number of volcanoes which ring the lake. Thousands of years ago, one of the volcanoes erupted. It created a lava dam at one end of the valley, and the river or stream that was flowing through it at the time backed up behind this dam and created this lake. There's a road that circumnavigates the entire lake, and there are little Mayan villages all along that stretch of road along the lake. Here's two more volcanoes, Toliman and Atitlan. Atitlan is the volcano in the foreground, I believe. Toliman sits behind it. The fisherman is in a little dugout canoe there. He is definitely a Mayan gentleman. And this is an early morning shot. So he had a net like the little boy in the Peten that I showed you earlier. And they cast the net out and they let it fall towards the bottom of the lake. This lake is very deep, so it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. But as it falls down through the water, fish get ensnared in the net, and then they pull it up and reap their harvest of fish. When you travel from Chichicastenango to the lake, you go through a junction called Los Encuentros. Chichi lies to the north, the lake to the south. To get to my favorite village where I stay, which is Santiago Atitlan, the best way, or the quickest way to get there, and actually I think it's probably the best way because it's quite fun. You take a ferry boat from the biggest town on the lake, which is called Panajachel. Halfway between Panajachel lies this village of Sololá. This photograph was taken on market day in Sololá. I'm pretty sure that market days in Sololá are Thursday and Saturday. But you take that ferry from Panajachel to Santiago Atitlan. Takes maybe 30 to 40 minutes. Were you to drive on the road from Panajachel to Santiago, that would take an hour and a half. And it's a wonderful trip on the boat across the lake. It is so scenic, and you get to drive by the volcanoes. It's just so pleasant. Here's a woman in traditional attire from Sololá. They're known for this bright red attire with this ikat weaving design. She has a sute on her head. She's a basket vendor, so she's got all this stuff, all her baskets wrapped up in this sute and a smaller sute on her head to make a flat platform for this load to rest on as she walks to her stall. One of the main exports of Guatemala, besides bananas, is coffee. And this is what coffee looks like on the coffee tree. And here is a bunch of coffee beans laid out to dry. Once they're dry, these gentlemen will collect them up and take them to the roaster or the distributor or whatever. In the early years when I first started going to Guatemala, as I said earlier, my first trip was in 80. My second trip was in 82. Between 1980 and 2018, I made approximately 16 trips there to photograph. At the end of this slideshow, I'm going to show you black and white photographs. I'm primarily a black and white photographer. These are sort of my travel log photos. And when I first started there in the early 80s, you couldn't really get good coffee in Guatemala, despite the fact that they grow very good coffee there. And that's because the Civil War was raging during the late 70s into the mid to late 80s, and there weren't a lot of tourists frequenting Guatemala at that time. And so they were shipping their best coffee to the States. Well, when the war ended in 1996, the war lasted from 1960 to 1996. Approximately, I believe it was 250,000 people were killed, and about that many more are missing and presumed dead at this point. Anyway, when the war ended, tourists started showing up, and they started keeping more of the better coffee in country. So little espresso joints started popping up everywhere, even in remote Mayan villages. Then leaving the lake and going further west from the junction at Los Encuentros is another very authentic Mayan village called Nahualá. They are also Quiche speakers like the folks in Chichicastenango. For years, Nawala would not let outsiders into their village, only Indians, only Mayan folk. They didn't necessarily have to be from Nawala, but they did not let Ladinos or Europeans in. They finally relaxed that. When I first started going to Nawala, I think my first trip there was in 1984. I would go to Nawala on a market day, and Nawala's market is, I believe, on Saturday, might be Sunday, the same as Chichi. I was usually the only gringo in town. Well, I hadn't gone there for a while, and then I went back in, I think it was 2000, and I walked into town, and on my left, just before this area that we're seeing along the road here, sort of behind where I'm standing, there was a new Mormon church built there. And the first two gringos I saw in town were Mormon missionaries, all dressed up in their suits and ties. And they saw me, and they were somewhat surprised that a gringo was there, and they started chatting me up. And at the time I lived in Utah, and when I told them that I was from Utah, they asked me if I was of their faith, and I am not. And so, but they were very pleased to see a fellow Utahn way down in Guatemala. This is a gentleman from Nawala. He's also a member of their Cofradia, again signified by his headdress. You can see he's wearing a black shirt with a very colorful collar. The collar is called cuello. That shirt, the black part is wool, and the cuello, and where it dips into his neckline, that would be cotton. Again, woven on a backstrap loom. And then outside of Nawala, even further west on the Pan Am Highway, or Carretera Interamericana, I had seen postcards of this church for years traveling there. So finally, in actually one of my later visits, I finally decided I got to go see this thing. So here's this Catholic church in a village. The village is called San Andres Xecul. There are many villages in Guatemala where there are three words in the name of the village, and the first two will be Spanish, so here, San Andres, and then the last word is a Mayan word, Xecul. So there's a town outside of Chichicastenango called Santo Tomas del Quiche, so Santo Tomas of the Quiche speakers. And so San Andres Xecul has this outrageous church. And here's a detail, and this is all plaster. And then you can see that it's a very elaborate color scheme. And imagine making these little anthropomorphic figures, and there's cactus at the bottom between these two guys or girls with their arms up holding the woman playing the guitar above them, and below them there are little yellow, those are cactus, and then there's this vine with the red berries all over it, and then over here on the right the guy's holding these, I don't know, leaves or branches with all that intricate black line work, painstaking stuff, amazing. And then one of my favorite authentic Mayan villages is Todos Santos in the Cuchumatanes Mountains. Cuchumatanes, again, is a Mayan word. And Todos Santos is in the department of Huehuetenango. Again, a department is analogous to our states. Huehuetenango borders Chiapas in Mexico, so it's on the western part of Guatemala. And the big city in the department is called Huehuetenango, the capital city. And you take a chicken bus from wherever, Guatemala City, Antigua, wherever you are off the Pan Am Highway. You get on the bus and go west to Huehue, and you get to Huehue by the end of the day because you've traveled let's say if you started in Antigua, you've basically traveled almost 2/3 of the length of the Pan Am Highway as it passes through Guatemala. And then you get to Huehue, spend the night, get up at crack of dawn, 6, 7 in the morning, and get on a chicken bus. And then 5 or 6 hours later, you'll arrive in Todos Santos. The distance from Huehuetenango to Todos Santos is approximately 40 kilometers. This is about 25 miles. So the bus takes anywhere from 5 to 7 hours to cover that distance. And I rented a vehicle to drive up to Todos Santos on, I don't know, 3 or 4 different occasions. And in the rental, I could get there in 3 hours. But even getting there in 3 hours, that means you're traveling at an average speed of about 8.5 miles per hour. And the road is in 3 stages. There's a very steep climb out of Huehuetenango, very twisty mountain road, very dusty in parts where the dust is so fine it's like talcum powder. It's best to wear a handkerchief over your nose and mouth if you're at the wheel, because you'll want the window open because it's still fairly warm. And then it levels off on top in the Altiplano, the high mesa, and this road is pretty flat, straight, and relatively smooth, so you can bomb along at about 45 or 50 kilometers an hour. 50 kilometers an hour is about 33 miles an hour. And then there's a steep descent into the village, and again, twisty, rutted, rough road. But finally, you level out, you come into Todos Santos, and they welcome you into town. Bienvenidos a Todos Santos. And then there's that sign there that says Venta de Ropa Típica. We're selling typical clothing. So they're already trying to prepare you as a tourist for your, what do we call it? Retail therapy. Retail therapy in Todos Santos. So these are adobe blocks. This gentleman is drawing the adobe blocks in anticipation of another structure, perhaps a shed or an addition to his home. This is a typical neighborhood in Todos Santos, and you can see 3 different economic strata in one neighborhood here. On the very left-hand margin of the photograph, there's a house that's cut in half, has adobe walls and a thatched roof. So these people are on the bottom of the economic ladder with the thatched roof. Then the houses in the middle, which have the tiles, so they have adobe walls and tiles. The tiles would be made in Guatemala. I don't think they're made in Todos Santos, but they're made in the country and delivered there. And then the house up at the top in the middle is a laminated metal roof with adobe walls. And that person is definitely the wealthiest that we can see in this photograph, because anything manufactured, especially of metal, is very expensive because it's imported. So for that person to be able to afford laminated metal, they have to have some money behind them. This is the main drag in Todos Santos. At the top of the photograph, just below and right of the Canada Dry sign, is the oft aforementioned chicken bus. It would have come from Huehuetenango. Just past where it's parked, there's a big plaza where it can flip a U-turn and come back. It parks there. The bus driver sleeps in the pension that night, which is this building on the left edge with the green walls and then the brownish gray bottom to the walls. That's also where I stayed. When I was in town, there were 2 pensions. I found this one to be the more luxurious. It was $1.25 a night to stay there. It had wooden plank beds with mattresses that were stuffed with hay or straw, literally. So you had this mattress with a cloth cover, but inside that cover was stuffed straw and hay. When I went back in 2000 with some folks. They had upgraded to foam mattresses on the wooden slats. That was a very welcome upgrade, very comfortable. Of course, I did have to pay $1.50 for the upgrade instead of $1.25 a night. This is the ice cream shop, the heladeria. And the sign above the door says, "We sell superior ice creams." On the right, on the face of the wall there, to the right of the door, you can see that's the menu, the various ice cream concoctions that you can get there. And this is a gentleman in traditional Mayan attire from Todos Santos. The red pants, the striped shirt, straw hat, and then you see he has this black sort of waistband thing around his nether regions. That's to keep that warm. Todos Santos is very cold because it's about 8,500 feet up in the mountains. He is crocheting a cotton bag. The men weave these bags while they tend their flocks of sheep and or pigs and cows. And this gentleman had lived and worked in Chicago for, I believe it was 3 years, and then he came back home, all the while, of course, while he was in Chicago, sending remittance home. Many Mayan men leave their village, and let's say they'll leave Todos Santos and go work on a banana plantation or a coffee plantation, and when they leave the village, they will tend to change out into Western attire because they don't want to be as conspicuous as an indigenous person when they travel about the country on public transportation. And oftentimes, let's say they go and work on a plantation for a couple, 3 years. When they leave, they're just accustomed to wearing Western clothes, and they return to their village and they don't continue to wear their traditional attire. One of the reasons I liked Todos Santos was because it was a village where men wore their traditional attire. The women still wear their traditional dress, even to this day, way more than men do. This is a little detail of a carved angel in the ceiling of the church in Todos Santos. Give you a little flavor for the socio-religious culture in a Mayan village. Again, here's a member of the Cofradia. This guy's from Todos Santos. You see his cuello, his collar there. That headband signifies he's a member of the Cofradia. And he has a sort of Western jacket over his traditional shirt, again to help him keep warm in the cold nights and mornings in the Cuchumatanes Mountains there. And here's me resting after a tough day of photography in the aforementioned pension, and that is the straw mattress. This was in, I believe this was in 97. I took my wife there for the first time. My wife is quite the traveler, quite a trooper. I have never taken her to a place that she thought was uncivilized enough for her. You see up on the top of the wall behind me, some Italian person visited and carved Italia in there, Italy. You can see also that I have a down sleeping bag on my bed because of how cold it is. And also, you can see there the bed cover over the mattress is very thin. And so you have this sleeping bag that you bring because you want to stay warm. And you also, that straw mattress tended to have insects in it. So you wanted to keep a layer between you and the insects and the straw mattress. So the Civil War raged, as I said, for 36 years. And one of the hottest spots was an area of the country known as the Ixil Triangle, I-X-I-L. Ixil is a language, a Mayan language. And I mentioned there were something like 25, 28 Mayan dialects. Ixil is spoken by, in the entire planet, maybe 70,000 people. So that's how specific these Mayan dialects are to their geographic area. The three main villages in Ixil are Chahul, Nebach, and San Juan Cotzal. this is a woman from Chahul. I was at market day in Chahul, and she, as you can see, she's quite lovely. She has her hair is probably as long as down to her waist. She has it all wound up in this and bound in this thing, and it all sits on top of her head. Her earrings are those yarns with the baubles attached. She has these very long slits in her earlobes, and she painstakingly threads each strand of yarn through her ear until she gets the desired amount in each ear. Her huipil, her blouse, is the most traditional huipil from Chahul, this bright red color. She was just a lovely woman, and I knew I had to take her picture, so I walked up to her, and I got about 3 feet from her. I looked right at her, and I said, in Spanish, "Can I pay you to take your picture?" And she said nothing. And her facial expression didn't change. And so I repeated my question 2 more times, and still nothing. So I was beginning to think that she was deaf. Well, after the 3rd time that I asked her, this guy runs up, grown man, and he says, "I'm her husband. What is it you're trying to ask her? She doesn't speak Spanish. She only speaks Ixil." I said, "Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm asking her if it would be permissible for me to take her picture if I paid her." And he said something to her in Ixil, and he turned to me. He said, "Yes, you may take her picture, and you will give me the money." And I took her picture, and I think it turned out pretty good. So in that same visit, this was all in 1984. I found these 2 sisters. I photographed them in front of the plastic back wall of a vendor stall, which faces to behind them. Again, you can see that they have their hair bound up in this woven piece that they do. They have the same earring thing going on. They both have a shawl over their shoulders. A rebozo is a shawl. Their huipiles are white. They're wearing them inside out because they don't have washing machines. So they wash all their clothing in either streams or lakes or rivers. And so they'll wear it for a week, and then when that side gets dirty, they turn it inside out and wear the other side. And then after that side gets dirty, when both sides are dirty, they'll take it and wash it. These photos were made in 1984. Most all these slides, if you're curious, are Kodachrome slides, especially from the early 80s. And this is a baby on her mother's back. This woman is from San Juan Cotzal. And because I'm familiar with the weaving designs, I know that. One interesting thing about the weaving designs, the Maya were already prolific and competent weavers when the Spanish showed up. But the Spaniards added a new twist to the weaving. They assigned virtually each village a certain design and encouraged the women to weave that design to represent their village. And this wasn't an altruistic thing on the part of the Spaniards, because they were greatly outnumbered by the Maya when they first got there. Their motivation, if you will, in doing this was to know where individuals were relative to their village. So if they saw a whole bunch of people from different villages amassing in one place, they would be suspicious that an uprising was about to occur. So by knowing the designs, they could spot people out of their own region amassing in others. Well, when the Civil War started in the 60s or 90s, well, it started in the 60s and went through the 90s, the Guatemalan military used their knowledge of the designs of individual village weavings to their advantage as well. And the Ixil Triangle was one, as I said, was one of the hot places during the war, and a lot of the guerrillas were based there. So you would travel across the country on the Pan Am Highway in a chicken bus, and the bus would get stopped at a checkpoint along the road. The military would be there. Everybody would file off the bus. Men would be pat searched for weapons, be they Indians or tourists, and indigenous people who were from, let's say, Ishil or other problematic areas of the war would be patted down with extra scrutiny. So the weaving has been a double-edged sword for the Mayan ever since the Spanish got there. And then the third village is Nebach. And this little girl is from Nebach. I actually photographed her on my second visit in 1982, even though I didn't go to Nebach for the first time until 1984 because of the war. And even in 84, it was somewhat dicey to go there. But she and her mother and her sister were in Antigua, the beautiful colonial ancient capital of, it was essentially the colonial capital of Central America, from where Mexico City's jurisdiction ended on the south all the way to Caracas, Venezuela. It's a, let's see, it would be about it's close to a 500-year-old town now. It's a UN heritage site. And this girl and her mom and sister were in the plaza there trying to make some money selling their wares to the tourists. She has a very typical Nebach we peel on. Again, the hairpiece. And she had such a lovely smile. Who could resist? In 1985 is when I drove down to Guatemala in my own vehicle. And I drove my truck up into the Ishil Triangle, and we stayed in Nebach. Nebach is the biggest village in the triangle. And there's a pension there called Pension de las Tres Hermanas, the Three Sisters. And it was the place to stay in Nebach. And this particular trip in 85, I went there, and there were a bunch of Guatemalan military types staying there. The colonel who was in charge of the military operations in the whole area, and some of his staff, and they were there every night that I was there. And the meals were always sort of a family style thing. You would eat at a large table with all the other guests. The pension only had maybe 6 rooms. And so for one dinner, I had to listen to the general expound about the guerrillas and, you know, what despicable human beings they were, and et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until I got back to Antigua a few days later that I realized that it was extremely dicey staying there while the military guy was there, because the pension could have easily become a target with him as the object of the assault. On the other hand, there was a certain honor among combatants and locals that certain areas were off limits. And because the Three Sisters had been there forever and were pillars of the community, I'm guessing that their pension was off limit, even if the entire Guatemalan army was staying there at once. And here I am taking photos in Chichicastenango. This is a medium format camera. Later, starting in about 85, I started taking a medium format camera and a large format camera, a wooden camera with a bellows. I didn't do much portrait work with the wooden camera, but a lot of architectural type things and street scenes and etc. and landscape photos. So I had talked about a backstrap loom, and this is a lady named Doña Rafaela. She is from a village near Antigua called San Antonio, Aguascalientes. She's got on her traditional weepeel. She is using a backstrap loom. And you can see it's tied to her waist, and off camera is a tree on the right. And you can see in her right hand, she's pressing a white object into the palm of her left hand. And that is a little stick that she does this intricate design work that's represented here by the flowers on her huipil. So I'm just going to show you some examples of the weavings. This is a Chichicastenango huipil. This is the old floral design. So you can see there are 3 panels here. There are 2 seams. You know, it's in thirds. And so the brown part of the huipil would be woven first in 3 pieces on a backstrap loom. Then they're sewn together. Then that little white tool that Doña Rafaela had in her hand would be used to do all this intricate work overlaying the initial brown structure. And then where the seams come together in the floral design, you can see these bars of color. That's covering up that sewed seam there. That little piece is called a ronda. This is a very old piece, perhaps 75 or more years old. This is the newer geometric design. Again, 3 pieces. Again, the rondas in the overlay geometric design part where the seams come together. You see a little string up the top on the right. That's to make the neck hole or head hole bigger so the person can get over their head. Many of these huipiles have little zippers in one or both of the seams about halfway down so that they can unzip it and breastfeed their children. And then something that's been happening a lot, and I think they do it mostly for huipiles that are in either dirty or kind of bad shape, they do this overdye, this orange-brown overdye. So that this huipil was not originally this color like this. This is an overdye they do to make it aesthetically more appealing to sell to a tourist. This is a sute from Nauala. This is about 2 feet wide by 4 feet long. So again, a very old piece. And then the cotton, the brown, the light tan brown color, that's the actual color of the cotton from the plant. It's not pure white. And then the design laid over the cotton. In this case, it's also cotton thread, but it's done with that tool that Doña Rafaela had. This is a belt from Nebach. This is about 10 inches wide and 8 or 9 feet long, and it'd be wrapped around the woman's waist 2 or 3 times to hold her skirt up. Again, the red is woven first, but in this case, it's one piece, 9 feet long. There are no seams in that part. And then this intricate geometric patterns that you see, those are added after the red is laid down. Here's a detail of the overlaid part. Very, very fine work. And you can see how tight the weave is on the red part there as well. This is the bag that the gentleman from Todos Santos was weaving. Very thick, sturdy stuff. He'd carry his lunch and some water and maybe another weaving project that he'd be working on while he tended to his flock. And then these are my black and white photos. This talk of the living Maya is in conjunction with an exhibit I have right now at the Courthouse Gallery that is curated by Capital City Arts Initiative. The Nevada Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities contributed funds to make this slide illustrated talk in conjunction with my show. The show is actually called Selected Works, The Maya of Guatemala and Western Landscapes. It'll be up through May 24th, 2023. The gallery is open 8 to 5, Monday through Friday every day at the county courthouse. And it's on the 2nd floor. So these were the quote-unquote real photographs I was making while I was taking my travelogue photos. So this is a gentleman and his son from Todos Santos. They're wearing traditional attire. You can see that Dad has the loincloth to keep him warm. They both have Western attire over their shirts, and those pants are red and white striped. This gentleman is from a village called Zaculeu, about an hour outside of Antigua to the west. As you can see, he let me get very close. This was taken with a normal lens, not a telephoto. I took this photograph about 2 feet from his face. He was very accommodating, and I got this, what I consider to be a very powerful portrait of this gentleman. This man sells pome, which is incense. In those slides back in Chichicastenango of the Cofradia guys at the church, one of the photos was very smoky, and that was the pome being burned. There was a guy off camera with a can that he twirls around in circles to let the incense smoke waft through the air. And he probably bought his incense from this guy. This guy was a fortune teller. He had a stall in the market, Chichi, and the way he told your fortune was he had a bird in a cage. He would take the bird out of the cage and hold a deck of cards in his hand and splay them out, and the bird would pick a card out of his hands with its beak. Then he would turn the card over and read it to you, and that was your fortune. But he had this incredible face with his entire life written on his face there. This gentleman is giving the other gentleman a haircut. As you can see, his cutting device is a straight razor, dry. And this was, he just had a stall, an outdoor stall, and people come by, and I believe it was 25 centavos. It was either 25 or 50 centavos for a haircut, which is 25 cents or 50 cents at that time. At that time, the Quetzal to the dollar exchange was 1 to 1. Later, well, now, today, it's about 7.5 to 1. The government controlled it 1 to 1 for years, and then finally, world economic pressure dictated that they had to let it float and establish a quote-unquote true market value. So this guy was charging 50 centavos for a haircut, and I gave him 5 quetzales, 10 times that amount, to allow me to photograph him giving the haircut. So I took about 8 or 10 frames of him doing the haircut, and this was by far the best. And so I took this in 84, so I took it in January of 84, so in about 10 months, this photograph will have been made 40 years ago. This is a more traditional barber shop in Chichicastenango, actually inside a building. Definitely a Mayan barber shop. The hygienic health department rules there aren't quite as stringent. As you can see, all the hair piled on the floor. And over on the left, in the top left corner, you can see a picture of 3 guys in it vertically. That is a little chart with the styles of haircuts that you can get. You just point to the style you want, and you get the haircut you want. This is a family shrine in a person's living room. I was making a photograph of the Mayan gentleman on a sidewalk just up the street from this place. And when I got done, I was walking back down the street, and I looked in the window, and I understand that a lot of the buildings, the vast majority of the buildings, have very thick adobe walls, like 2 feet deep. And then on the inside part of the wall, in the interior of the room, is a wooden shutter that closes. And then it opens to let light in. There is no screen and there is no glass. So everything's open air. And I was walking down the street, and I just glanced through this window, and I saw this, and I was so taken by it. And so I stuck my head through the window, and I actually had my head in their living room. And the owner came into the room, and I was very embarrassed. And I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stick my head in your living room." And he said, no, that's fine, it's okay. And I said, would you let me photograph this shrine? I'd be honored, and I'll pay you and everything. And he said yes. And in the course of setting up, I used the wooden camera to take this photograph. And in the course of setting up the camera and making the photo, he explained to me that the guy whose face is obscured in the picture frame by the flowers down at lower left, that's his son. And this whole shrine was fabricated to pay honor to his son who had passed away. And then this little girl's from Santiago Atitlan, my favorite village on the shores of Lake Lake Atitlan. And she was carrying this rooster around, and she was pretty sassy, and she was giving me a hard time. And I said, well, I'll pay you if you let me make a photograph. And they're all little street hustlers, and many of them don't go to school, and they just try to sell stuff to tourists. So she had this rooster, and I set up the camera, and I start chatting her up, and I said, what's your rooster's name? And she said, it doesn't have a name. And I said, well, is its name Lunch? And she laughed, and it probably did end up being Lunch at some point. And this little girl's the sister of a guy named Gaspar. It was Gaspar and his brother and his sister. And the three of them, Gaspar was the oldest, his brother was the middle, and the sister was the youngest. Gaspar and his brother, I'm sorry, but Gaspar's brother and her names escape me in the moment. Those two guys were street hustlers, and they would roam the streets of Nebah. They're from the Yashil Triangle, from Nebah. And they would roam the streets. They had a shoe shine box, and they'd hit people up to shine their shoes, or maybe they'd luck out and get some, little tasks to do at somebody's house for money. Well, the three of them were orphans. Their parents had been killed in the war, and they were living with their aunt and uncle. And you can tell by Gaspar's sister's blouse that they are not well off whatsoever. But they were very engaging little kids. And as a gringo, you go to Nebah and you hang out for 3 or 4 days, and they just follow you incessantly. So eventually you buy them tacos from street vendors or give them money whether they do anything or not, because that's the thing to do. This woman is from Chahul. Again, the inside out we peel because she's trying to, go as long as she can between washings. Again, the hair piled up in the braided woven device to keep it on her head, and the yarn earrings through slits in her hair. Very pretty girl. I couldn't pass photographing her.